Hello YouTube, we are back with another video for you all today, and this one was requested by a few of you after watching some of our gameplay commentary. Thank you so much, by the way, for all the support that series has been getting. We've had a lot of fun making those videos, so we hope to keep cranking them out for you. We really appreciate all the support, truly. And this video has been a long overdue. I know a few of you, like I said, have asked for this, and this one is really going to be about breaking down and taking a look at Hunters as a deck. To the best of my ability, of course. I'm not going to claim to be the expert at Hunters, but I have played it a decent amount as of late, and have found some pretty decent success with it, both on a regional level as well as like just at, your friendly locals. Coming from a cross player, I felt like this was a very natural progression, and is a deck that is still very, very strong in the BT13 format, which is now wrapping up, and I still think it's going to be strong moving into BT14 and EX5. It has a very toolboxy feel to it, which I personally enjoy, but it does take a little bit of luck as well as a little bit of more advanced understanding of the nuanced mechanics of the deck, sort of the ins and the outs, that really allow you to pilot it well and as efficiently as possible. I think that's what really does separate, Hunters players who do find success and Hunters players who are kind of like, well, isn't this deck supposed to be good, right? So that's the whole purpose of this video is, well, to help you guys who aren't as familiar with Hunters or just trying to learn the deck a little bit more, get more acquainted with the deck, and learn how to play it, learn how to pilot it more effectively so that, if you do choose to bring it to a regionals or a locals, that you kind of have fun with it and hopefully you find some success with it as well. So because we are aiming to focus more on the breakdown and the discussion aspect of this, I'm not going to really go into a card-by-card deck list. I'll have a photo of the list that I brought to a regionals as well as a photo of, what I've been running at locals as well so that you guys can see it. And it's going to be right here down below or above, wherever I end up putting it. It is a pretty standard one, I'm not going to lie. I don't think there's a whole lot of variety in terms of like tech choices or like one-ofs that, really make the deck stand out. It's very, very similar to Cross, where you kind of have your set ratios for your pieces so that you can see them in the right ways, at the right times as well. So if you have any questions about what the cards do, I'm gonna try my best to explain some of the ones that do come up every now and then. But I'm gonna do, my best. But if you do have those questions, feel free to drop them in the comments down below. Also, feel free to just go on like Digimon.carddev or like Digimon app and, read the cards, and if you have any questions after that, please, like I said, please do let me know. But yeah, that's the deck list, and moving on to the sort of the key pieces. So, Hunters as a deck really relies on Tamers, right? And Tamers and setup. If you don't have either of those sort of optimized in your early like turns 1 through 3, you really do struggle. So because Hunters as a deck really wants to ramp up its Digivolution and use your resources in a way to make your Digivolution more effective and more efficient, and then go into your sort of combo plays after that. Whereas, for example, like for Crossheart players, if you're playing Cross, you really want to just stay low to the ground, play out your bodies, have them swing. If they die, great, then you save your resources, do it all over again, right? With Hunters, it's a little bit different. You're kind of setting your resources up so that you can use them moving forward. So it's a little bit of a reversed sort of thought process there. But it really does rely on its Tamers, and you're really dealing with 4 main Tamers in Hunters. The first we'll talk about real quickly and highlight is Tagiru, which is up here on the upper left-hand corner. It's your memory setter for the deck. It'll set you to 3 and allows you to suspend it to use resources from underneath any of your Tamers as Digivolution sources to reduce the cost by 1. Taiki and Uemano both do the same thing, where you can suspend them to reduce the Digivolution cost by utilizing one of your resources as an inheritable. Taiki is your draw engine, will really let you draw and cycle through your pieces, and Yu lets you just gain a memory by tucking a card under it as a resource. as you'll come to see, the sort of mantra of hunters is cycle, 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 and even more cycle, right? I'll usually tell folks like a good hunter's game is like you cycle through 40 to 50% of your deck, you know, and that's what you really want to do, to be able to just filter through like, these are pieces I need, these are pieces I don't need right now, I can see them later. And you've got to make that decision all the time of what you pick up, what you use, and how to utilize them. So it is a bit of a sort of a mental gymnastics playing this deck, but the payoff is really, really good, in my opinion. I think it's a very fun deck and a very powerful deck if you play it well. So how do we set this up, right? Like, we've talked so much about what the pieces are, but how do we set these pieces up? Usually when I'm mulliganing my hand, or like looking at my hand and choosing whether or not to mulligan, I'm really looking for a rookie and a tamer, okay? The rookie is there just so that you can digivolve in the back and have it ready to go to swing next turn. The tamer is great if you have to play it out. I think that's okay, but I think the more ideal play is to get a Shoutmon King version, digicross. Shoutmon King's effect will allow you to play out a Tagiru, Taiki, or Uemano from hand without paying the play cost, and you can go ahead and play them for free. So in my opinion, that's sort of like the absolute like goated first turn play for hunters. Digivolve in the back, digicross with a Shoutmon King version, and play out a tamer. You know, will that happen all the time? No, right? But I think if you can do that, that's what you want to do. But I think the essentials in a hand are a rookie and a tamer. Those are almost like non-negotiable for a hunter's hand if you want to start off well. But if you are able to pull that Shoutmon King version play out, which is digivolve, then digicross, play out a tamer, pass turn, that's ideal for a couple of reasons, right? First and foremost is that you're playing out tamers for free, right? Which is absolutely what you want to do. The second of all, you have a body in the back that's ready to go. You have a body in Shoutmon King version, which more likely than not will survive the turn one, because either your opponent will be setting up their own tamer, digivolving, but they're not really able to interact with your board, but you have him ready to go. So turn 2, or your subsequent turn 2, you can promote the rookie, swing, it most likely will die, so you can draw off a Monimon, and you can swing with Shoutmon King version. If you have the right inheritable under King version, you can also draw. Whether it's Psych or Gumdra, you can draw a card when attacking. So what you've done now is, by turn 2, you've gotten your opponent down to 3 security, you've set up a tamer, and you also now have resources under said tamer, because one of those pieces probably died, if not both. And you're ready to go. You know, like, this is perfect setup. The reason I am hounding on the draw power with the Monimon and hoping to have like a Psych or a Gumdra under your Shoutmon King version is, if you do that turn 1 play, you've left yourself with 2 cards, which can be a pretty sticky situation to find yourself in if you're not top decking the right piece. So be careful with that as well, because if you find yourself with only 2 cards in hand, sometimes you have a dead turn where it's like, well, now I can't do anything. And you don't want to do that. So I think that's sort of a good summary of your early turn, which is basically set up some early aggression, get a rookie in the back, set up a tamer if you can, and that should be your turn 1, which then bleeds into like what your turn 1 and turn 3 wants to be too, because the first couple turns, I usually say focus on your tamers. If you can get tamers out, just get them out, right? Because that's what you're going to be using as you evolve into the mid-game phase of ramping your plays up and trying to get to where you want to be so that you can close things out. So you really want to be getting at least 2-3 tamers out by the middle of the game, just because that's how your setup will succeed. If you're running into like mid-late game and you only have 1 or 2 tamers on board, you're in a pretty tough spot. And I think you're probably on the back foot by that point. So first few turns is tamers and cycle. Tamers and cycle. Now, speaking of tamers, you know, why they're so important to your game plan is they allow you to tuck resources underneath to proc effects, and then also eventually, like I said, suspend to reduce your digivolution cost. Now, what do you tuck and what do you not tuck? that's where a lot of people find themselves tripped up, because it's very, very easy to get lost in the sauce of, let me tuck everything. Everything I see, tuck, 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 because I want that draw off of Taiki. I want that memory off of you, I want to reduce my Digivolution cost, guys. Let's tuck. That can be dangerous, because if you tuck too much, you are diminishing your hand, and you're diminishing your resources to play out, because sometimes you can easily find yourself in a situation where, you tuck something and then a turn later you're like, shit, I needed that. Or even that same turn, you're like, that I could have done this here if I only kept that card in hand, right? So you really need to think about what your tucking and your resource management plays are a little bit more carefully than what it may seem like at first. Another thing I do want to point out with this is that your tucking for Tamer's effect is a start of main phase effect. It's not a main phase effect. And I bring that up for a couple of reasons, because we see a lot of main phase effects, right? Like in the new BT14 set, BT13, you had a lot of cards that were like, main phase, do this. And you could really choose to do it at any point at the right time. With the start of main, you have a more restricted window to do that. And what I mean by that is your start of main phase is really if you choose to hatch a Digitama or choose to raise from the breeding area. That's when you can proc your start of main. If you do anything else, play an option card, you Digivolve, you swing, you've missed that window to tuck your resources. So if you hatch or you promote, immediately think about, okay, what am I tucking? And if so, declare it. Because again, if you're playing in these like bigger scale, large scale tournaments, they're gonna be very nitpicky about that, because that's a huge game mechanic you should be aware of. If you're at locals, hopefully they just kind of correct you and you can move on with the plays. But do keep that in mind, because it is easy to kind of autopilot and do things and be like, oh wait, I wanted to tuck, Now, in terms of what you want to be tucking in, I say absolutely 100% you want to be tucking Clockmon. Clockmon here is a 4 to play. He is a blocker and does let you search. So sometimes early game, if you have to throw him out there, that's okay. But I will say, like, if you can get him under your tamers early, the ability to give your stack jamming is huge, in my opinion. Especially when we get into our top ends, which we'll be talking about in a quick second here. Being able to swing in, and obviously you worry about blockers and stuff, but like if you're not being blocked and you know that you have free reign into security, knowing that you have jamming is just so good, man. Like it makes your play so much more aggressive. You feel more confident going and doing the plays, as opposed to being like, if I swing, is he gonna die? Am I gonna lose my resources? Yada yada. So having Clockmon as your inheritable, I think, is absolutely mandatory, which is why I run him at a 4. I know some people choose to run Clock at like 3. I've seen some mad lads do it at like 2, which I'm like, that's absolutely insane, guys. But like, I think a 4, just to see him and being like tucking him under your sources, to use him as a resource to Digivolve, I think just really makes this deck super, super aggressive and can help it keep up. Other things you want to tuck are probably the ones that give you a little bit of draw power, or especially early game, right? Being able to draw and cycle through helps you find more pieces. I think, dealing with bigger boards, you can choose to tuck like a King version or an Ikakimon, which helps you control a little bit DP wise. But I think the one thing that is an absolute must is Clockmon. Everything else I think is a very situational thing. But like I said, with the caveat being, you really want to be planning your plays like 2-3 turns ahead. So really be careful of what you're tucking and be mindful of your hand, be mindful of your plays. That's really all I can say on that note. So moving on to the late game. So now you've set your tamers up, you've got your pieces ready to go, and you're like, well, what now? Right? What do we do? You have 2 boss ends, and I think it's a pretty good time to really talk about, I guess 3 technically speaking, but 2 main ones. First one is OmniShoutmon. I really like him as sort of your first pseudo boss monster. He has the ability to delete multiple bodies and pop little guys on board that really help with board control, and can be very, very clutch when it comes to just keeping your plays alive for an extra turn or slowing your opponents down for an extra turn. He can typically pop up to 10k DP worth. So that's another thing to note, is that it's not minus 10k DP on one Digimon. You can delete up to 10k worth of Digimon. So at base, he starts off as you can delete up to 4k total worth of Digimon on the field. But for every 2 sources it has, which is where your tamers and tucking things underneath as you Digivolve becomes very, very important. If you have every 2, you add 3k DP to that deletion potential. So if you have 4 sources, you can bump your way up to 10k total DP. If you have 6 sources for some reason, you're able to delete up to 13k DP, which is absolutely insane. If you have 4 more sources as well, you get security check +1. Paired that with the Clockmon, giving him jamming, potentially pairing him with Watchmaker, giving him an extra security check, sometimes 3k or 3 checks jamming. Pretty good, right? Even early game, right? Like you control board, you're swinging 2 checks with jamming, your opponent is sort of forced to deal with it. It's still a really, really good play. Forces your opponent to keep up, forces them to probably make a suboptimal play if, you know, they're kind of rushed into doing something because they have to deal with this guy. One thing to keep in mind with him, as well as Arresterdramon Superior Mode, which we'll talk about soon, is that they do not save, unfortunately. You know, they do not save themselves and they do not save their resources. So if you choose to go into either of these guys, know that if they leave the field, your resources are gone. So that's the double-edged sword of these boss monsters per se. But speaking of boss monsters, our sort of bona fide top end here is Arresterdramon Superior Mode. This card arguably has access to like the best removal in the game, in my opinion. It's effective when Digivolving at baseline, can tuck a level 3 Digimon under your opponent's Digimon or an opponent's Tamer. For every different color Tamer you have in play, you can tuck an additional level. So for example, if you have 3 different color Tamers, you can tuck up to a level 6 under either, like I said, either under opponent's Digimon or under an opponent's Tamer, which is absolutely bonkers. You know, it's very similar to Chaos Degrade in that it can sort of circumvent a lot of these leaving battle or leaving the battle area, because technically they're still there. They're just in a different setting or underneath something. So really, really good removal. I really like that in terms of just control and dealing with stuff. Similar to X7 as a top end in terms of like big removal mechanic. But I think the problem with X7's removal mechanic is that there's so many ways now that cards prevent deletion by effect. So even if you get there, sometimes you're like, well, it doesn't proc because they're protected anyways. Arresterdramon says, bye-bye. Good luck with that. You know, so I really like it for that. And another thing that really makes this card so good is its end of turn effect, which is it can attack without suspending. Now, what does that mean, right? Because that's not something we've seen before, typically with anything in Digimon. And basically what that means is that you can swing, and then you can pass turn. Once you pass turn, Arresterdramon can say, I'm going to swing again. Even if it's suspended, it can swing again. So you can imagine how you can sneak a lot of plays, or sneak a lot of games even, with this effect. Because, you know, if you have your early pokes in, right, like our turn 1 cheeky play brings your opponent down to 3 security. If you're able to swing like one more time with a smaller body, get him down to 2, Arresterdramon can come into play if you have a Watchmaker to give it an extra security check. Okay, well now you're cooking, because Arresterdramon will be able to swing potentially 2 checks at jamming. You pass turn if it lives, and it says, okay, well I'm going to swing again. That's game, right? Your opponent can't even get to the next turn, even though you've passed them over, right? So I think it's a very sneaky way to get games in, and I think Definitely something that you should be working towards as a Hunters player. That's sort of like your ideal win con, is going into Arrestor, clearing the remainder of their security, and then going for game. Obviously, it's a great removal option, so if you have to play it, you play it. But I do think try to reserve this for like the late mid to late game, because that's where it's probably going to be the most effective. Because like I said, if it goes away or your opponent does find a way to deal with it, you lose all your resources. So a too preemptive superior mode play can definitely hurt you. So sort of a quick recap and kind of a quick discussion on strengths and weaknesses of this deck. Obviously, as you can tell, like the deck does very, very well with speed, does very, very well with tempo. It is a very fast, aggressive deck, and can really hit you fast if you're not looking and prepared to face it. It's very consistent as well, which is very dangerous because, like I said, an ideal Hunter's deck is cycling through 40 to 50% of the deck. You should be consistent with that. You should be able to find your pieces that way. Another thing that I think gives it a lot of viability is Quartzmon. Outside of Bloomlord, I think Hunters is probably the next most cost-efficient way to get Quartz on the board. You have two ways to get into Quartz with Hunters. You can choose to run the Ostamon package, which is basically just one Ostamon and Quartz. Basically, Asta just lets you go into Quartz for a more cheaper, reduced cost. Whereas if you just want to straight Digivolve Quartz on top of Superior Mode or OmniShoutmon, you can just do that for 9. The reason I say it's probably the most efficient is that you more likely than not have a ton of Tamers on board. You have a couple bodies on board as well. Quartz can be super cheap that way because of its, gaining memory effect for every 2 that's in play, both including you and your opponents. So you can go into Quartz for 9, but if your opponent plays to your strengths, you could make that 4 or 5 cost Quartz. It's not bad at all, right? The argument for Quartz or against Quartz might be the fact that it's very easily removed. And sort of like I said with Superior Mode and OmniShoutmon, if you lose your sources, they're all gone. So I know people will say, well, Quartz could hurt you. Well, yeah, but if you're smart about it, I think it can buy you a turn where your opponent is sort of forced to deal with it, because if they don't, it's pretty much game next turn. So they're going to have to commit a lot of resources into getting rid of Quartz, which buys you a turn to do what you need to do to hopefully go for game at that point. So whether Quartz is your win button or Quartz is your route to the win button, I still think it's very, very good for the deck. And I think, like I said, Hunters makes it so much more efficient. The fact that it's a very toolboxy deck, the fact that things like OmniShoutmon can pop a huge board and get security check +1, things like Clockmon give it jamming. You have your inheritables, which allow you to draw, but also inheritables that allow you to neg DP, that allow you to pop 4k or less, that allow you to buff up +2k DP. There's so many things you can do with your inheritables on top of just your tamers, and what you can manipulate your draw power and your memory power with is just so good and so adaptable. And I just think, sort of going to that consistency piece I talked about, the amount of cycle you do, right? Particularly in a meta where we're seeing a lot of big stack decks come back into play, like Fenrir Luga, or Metal Garuru, Wargrey. They rely on a big stack to draw and to kind of build the line. If you brick, sometimes there's just very few ways to get yourself back into the game. Hunters is almost like the exact opposite. You could have a real shit first hand, but Hunters can still find a way to cycle its way back, And that's the beauty of it, I think, and that's why I personally love it, is there's a lot of sort of pilot-dependent ways to go about doing certain things, and honestly, I learn more about the deck playing it every time I play it, because I'm like, oh, you know what? I could do that differently by doing this, because there's just more tools in the toolbox. There's just so much. Weaknesses, however, are things like Hades Force and Tamer Hate. Any deck that interacts with your Tamers and suspends them or straight up kills them will be a boon to this deck, particularly with how reliant you are on them. All your resources are in the hands of your Tamers. If your Tamers die, you die along with them, unfortunately. So that's just an unfortunate circumstance. Tamer clumping can happen as well. And what I mean by that is that I talked about cycling and I talked about draw power. Sometimes you just find yourself drawing Tamer after Tamer after Tamer, and that feels bad because you can't tuck Tamers under Tamers. You just have to hard play and hope you top deck the next piece, right? So it can be a bit cumbersome that way if it does happen to you, but there are ways around it. Cards like Drakmon from BT12 allow you to sort of discard Tamers to redraw and kind of reset your hand. So there are ways to get through it. And it doesn't happen that often, but it can happen. Security will often also just be kind of doo-doo, you know? You're running a lot of Digimon. More often than not, it's going to be like low-level Digimon that your opponent can just plow right through. If they're an OTK deck that just wants to just push through security, they're probably going to be able to do it no problem. The only thing that can be your saving grace is that if they hit a bunch of Tamers in security, that helps you out, if anything. But I think more often than not, you know, you can be stuck in a situation where if your security is just kind of dog water, then, you know, it does feel bad. I think the last thing is just mental fatigue, right? Like, we've talked a lot about what you need to run your optimal play, what you need to set up, what you need to anticipate and look forward to as you're playing this deck. So there's a lot of things that you need to do right. So there's a very fine margin for error. Your plays need to be well thought out, well planned out, and really drawn up to a T. Which is where if you're playing this at a big scale event that's going 8, 9, sometimes 10 rounds, good luck, soldier, because it can be very taxing. I've done it and it's rough, you know. You really have to have that mental fortitude. You know, props to my buddy Shamoon who plays the hell out of this deck. He won his Nats invite through this deck, and I don't know how he does it and keeps his attention span that long, but you know, shout out to him for kind of giving me a few pointers along the way too. But you really have to practice and know this deck very well, I think, to have that stamina to do it. So definitely something that takes time. You know, it takes time and takes an investment. But I do think it is an investment that if you're willing to put in, that it does reward you very, very well. So moving forward, right? You know, do we see Hunters adapting to BT14 and EX5? Absolutely, 100%. You know, I still think you're going to see Hunters. I still think Hunters is going to make plays. I think it's going to place at Nationals. It may not get top 16, but I do see it topping like top 32, top 64, 100%. Maybe a few can sneak into top 16 just because it's so good. It has the tempo, it has the consistency, and you know, those are two things that in these big scale tournaments wins games. Being able to just outpace your opponent and be more consistent with your plays and your pieces. I mean, it's what you want to do in any sort of card game. And I think it's going to be around for a while. You know, I'm a cross player, and I think cross is still very viable with the right pilot and the right setup. And I think Hunters will be right there with it. You know, I don't think people will keep playing it as often as they did before just because of like shiny toy syndrome, right? You've got the new decks, you've got the new things. You obviously want to play with the new stuff. You don't want to play with the old stuff, but I think Hunters, while being an old toy, is still a really good toy, you know? And I think it's very similar to Cross, where you're going to see it even past EX5 because it's all reliable. You know, people can pick up this deck for cheap, mind you, as well, and still do really well with it, you know, and still keep up with today's meta. So I think you're absolutely going to see Hunters moving forward. I still think that if you want to pick up this deck and learn how to play it, it's well worth it. It's a fun deck. It's a good deck. And I think it really helps you kind of learn more about the game in general. I think you genuinely, I think the better Hunters player you become, I think the better player you become, I think, by learning more about the game and analyzing your plays a lot more. So I really am a proponent of, if you want to try this deck out, go for it. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. I know it's a bit of a longer one, so I apologize for that, but hopefully this gave you guys a little bit of pointers, a little bit of tips and tricks on how to play hunters. Again, shout out to my buddy Shamoon for kind of talking me through sort of the plays that he used to do with hunters, because as I started learning this deck. And also shout out to Arby. He's our resident hunters player, as you may have seen in our commentary videos. Much better hunters player than I am. So if you have any questions for him, please feel free to leave them in the comment section down below. We are all looking forward to BT13, which at the time of recording will be coming out in just a few days. So we will be trying to churn out some deck profiles and deck discussions that kind of highlight the bigger hitters of BT14, like Fenrir Luga, Yellow Vaccine, Wargrey. So please feel free to check those out when they come out. We're excited to give you guys more content to look forward to. We're having a ton of fun making this for you guys, and it really does warm our hearts to see the support that we've been getting. So thank you guys for watching. Thank you guys for always tuning in. Thank you guys for all the support. It really does mean a lot, and we hope to keep it moving forward for you guys. We'll see you on the next one. Peace out.